Alright guys, so this is the part 2 of this series called Taxonomy. We've been talking about this series uh, for quite some time now. This is just the part 2 of the series. So in the part 1 we talked about the botanical names or the scientific names of organisms. For example, man was Homo sapiens. We talked about tiger, Panthera tigris. We talked about lion, Panthera leo. So if you missed that video, it will help you, to teach you the botanical names, the scientific names of organisms. So I recommend you go back and watch it. Now, this is the part 2. Part 2, we're going to be focusing on classifying living things based on hierarchy. So hierarchy, it's important. And there's some exams in biology where you may be asked to write the correct hierarchical order of the classification of living things. And this is what we're going to focus on right now. So the order, there are about 8 major groups in this order, this correct order. And I'm going to put that in the right order right now. So the first guy that comes here is the domain. Let me put it at the middle. Is domain. Domain is the first guy here. All right. Then from domain, it moves on to kingdom. Kingdom. Go from domain to kingdom. For most textbook, they don't capture domain. That's why it's a problem. Most people only know it that it begins with kingdom, but there is something that comes before kingdom, and that is domain. Now that is it for that. And after domain, what comes after domain is phylum. 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 Now, it can either be phylum or it can be division. So it's important that you know both of them. And also it's even more important to know which is for which. For example, division is for plants. You see that now. And phylum here is for animals. So it's good to know that. Very important. Now what comes after phylum / division is what I call class. Class comes right after. Then what comes after class is what I call order. Then what comes after order is family. Family comes after order. Then what comes after family is of course genus. So genus comes after family. Then what comes after genus is what I call species. Species. So these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, that's 9 now. 8 or 9 are about. So these are the order. These are the hierarchical order. Hierarchy talks about something being ranked from highest to lowest. So in this case, the highest are the domain and the kingdom. Then the lowest are the genus and the species, with species being the lowest. Though there's one more called subspecies, but it's not so common, so we just pack the boss at species and that's fine. Now, you may be wondering, how can I remember this order, this hierarchical order of classifying living things? It's very easy. Do not try to memorize it. Do not try to cram this. It'll be difficult for you. There's a mnemonic that I always use. I have 2 mnemonics. I have Dear King Philip came over for good spicy soup. I also have the King's play cards on fine grain sand. So I'll give both of them to you. One of my mnemonic here is Dear. See that now? King Philip came over for good soup. That's my mnemonic number 1. My mnemonic number 2 is the kings play cards on fine green sand. The kings play card on fine green sand. Alright, now each of these you see has got a meaning. Now Let's use dear King Philip came over for good for this. This dear you see stands for domain. Then the king you see stands for kingdom. The Philip stands for phylum. The chem stands for class. The over stands for order. The for stands for family. The genus stands for species. The good stands for genus, like you can see here. And the soup, of course, stands for species. So if you're cool with using dear king came over for good soup, you're good to go, because this will help you remember. Now, suppose I were to use the king's play cards and fine grain sand. D stands for domain, king stands for kingdom, play stands for phylum, card stands for class, on stands for over, fine stands for family, grain stands for genus, and of course S stands for what's it called now? Species. So whichever mnemonic you're more acclimatized to use, you're good to go. The most important thing is remembering this, hierarchy in the right order. Now, that is just one side of the pendulum. The next thing you have to understand is what happens to them. These are even where questions emanate from the most in a typical biology exam. Now, you have to know what is happening here. I already told you that the kingdom and domain, they are the highest, parts of this. My battery is running low. You have to know that kingdom and domain are the highest part of it. Then you have to know what happens to them as you go from top to bottom. Now, there's also something called inclusivity. Then we have exclusivity. The higher part, that is this part, you can see the domain, the kingdom, they are the most. Let me use a different color pen right now. The higher part, like domain and kingdom, are the most inclusive. Know that, very important. Most inclusive. Then the lower parts, like the genus and the species, are the most exclusive. You see that now? Yes, know this part. Now let me tell you how a typical question will be asked from here. It might possibly be asking you exam that which of the following, all right, from the hierarchy is the most inclusive? A can be kingdom, for instance. B can be class. C can be order. Of course, your answer becomes kingdom. But if you ask that which of the following is the most exclusive, for example, A, genus, B, order, C, class. So what becomes your answer? Your answer becomes genus, because the bottom part you see that the most exclusive. So it must not be genus alone. You might see species, you might see family. So just know that this lower part are exclusive, then the top parts are inclusive. That's the way it works. Now, the second thing you have to know here is what happens about the similarity and the number of organisms. So we're going to draw an arrow going to the south direction, which is the bottom part right now. Let me draw the arrow right now, show you something important. Alright, this is the arrow. As we're going down from top to bottom, that is from domain, all the way down to species, there's something that happens about the number of organisms. So as we go from top to bottom, let me change my pen. The number of the organisms increases. So number of organisms increases, number of organisms increases. You see that now? Then the next thing that happens here is that the similarity, number of organisms decreases because pattern not increases. The number of organisms decreases. Then the next thing that happens is the similarity. Then the similarity you see will decrease. Then the similarity will decrease. So this is what happens here. Now, let me explain this in summary. So I talked too much about this. We've discussed them. So domain all the way down to species. I use the King Philip, then I use the King, play cards, and fine grain sand. Whichever one you find easy to use it. That is the first step. You have to know how these things are called, how this hierarchy are ranked. in the correct order. I've given you two mnemonics, you can choose any one that suits you. Number two, you have to know which of them are the most inclusive and which are the most exclusive. So the top parts are the most inclusive, that is the domain, kingdom, and the likes. And the bottom parts you see are the most exclusive. So they can ask you, I've shown you a way, you can expect questions from that wise. Then the third thing we talked about is the number of organisms and the similarity. So it means this top part, the domain, kingdom, phylum / division, they will have the highest number of organisms. Then the bottom part, like the genus, species, we have the lowest number of organisms. So it means organisms are highest at the bottom, then they're lowest at highest at the top rather, then they're lowest at the bottom. Then as we're going down, the similarity of organisms. So it means organisms tend to be more similar as we go from top to bottom. So it means the bottom part will have higher organism similarity. But other way they ask you the question in the exam, you might be asked that which of the following, you see now, we have the highest number of organisms. A can be kingdom, B can be phylum, C can be class. Of course, kingdom becomes your answer. Or you can be asked in your exam that which of the following, all right, among the hierarchy, we have the highest similarity of organisms. Of course, we said as we go from top to bottom, similarity increases. So it means genus, species, family will have the highest similarity. I hope you got that. Alright, that is it for this video. And this is the part 2 of taxonomy, like I said. As we advance to part 3, 4, 5, and all that, I will expose you to several other imperative things. Alright guys, I hope you learned something. Don't forget to share the video with your friends and leave a comment below, like the video, and subscribe so you can see my next video when I upload. Thanks for watching.